Imagine a child, maybe your child, chatting away in an empty room, laughing at jokes only they can hear, and whispering secrets to someone who, well, isn't there. Welcome to the often charming and yet sometimes chilling world of imaginary friends, a place where innocence meets the unexplained. Are they harmless, invented in the mind for company, perhaps? Or is it possible that at least some of them exist beyond the mind as something far more mysterious or darker? In this episode of Into the Fog, we will uncover eerie eyewitness accounts of potentially paranormal encounters with the strange and inexplicable. What you're about to hear might make you question who or what is lurking in the shadows of classrooms and playrooms and bedrooms of the young. Because I'm Peter Laws, and tonight we ask, who are the INVIZIKIDs? When you were a kid, I hope you were lucky enough to have friends. But my question is, could anybody else see them? The reason I ask that is because young children consistently report having friendships, sometimes quite close ones, with what researcher Malcolm Hallowell calls INVIZIKIDs. These are childhood companions who are simply not there. A real-life example would be the true case of a girl who would come home from preschool and she would eagerly tell her mother all about her new friend, Susha. She said she wanted to have a backpack in the same color as Susha's. She wanted matching hair ribbons too. And at first, the mother didn't really think much of it, but her daughter just kept going on and on about Susha every single day after school. Well, anyway, one morning, after dropping her daughter off from school, the mother's curiosity got the better of her, and she asked the teacher to point out who Susha was. Maybe she could arrange a play date. And yet the teacher looked puzzled and said, we don't have a Susha in this class. Oh, the mother said, has she left, or is she in a different class? And the teacher said, no, you don't understand. We have never had a Susha in this class, or indeed this school. Imaginary friends are most often reported by children aged 3 to 6 years old. And they tend to vanish by the age of 8. However, they can stay in the life of a child for a surprisingly long time. A BBC article on the topic recently noted that it's not unusual for a 12-year-old to even admit that their imaginary friends are still an active part of their life. One study looked at the diaries of adolescents and found that imaginary friends can even carry on into the teenage years. Now, don't get me wrong, these teens weren't troubled or particularly lonely. They were creative people, totally socially active people, and yet for some reason they found having an imaginary friend helpful. And of course, there are some adults that even talk as if they have imaginary friends. Heck, I've written novels, and I have had the same experience as some authors have told me they have too, where characters I've invented seem to take on a life of their own. I write a scene expecting them to do one thing, and then suddenly I find my hands typing because the character is doing the opposite, and I'm just observing and writing down what I see. It's pretty weird. But anyway, back to children. Statistically speaking, girls are more likely to have imaginary friends, but the margin isn't that huge. Firstborn children and only children are more likely to have them. And research into the area say that about 45 to 65% of children play with an INVIZIKID at some point in their life, which would suggest to me that invisible friends really are quite a normal part of childhood. This means that a sizable amount of you listening to me now would have had an imaginary friend. I would love it if you could tell us about them in the comments, share their names, what you used to do together. I'm going to tell you about my childhood companion later, but let me put it this way. Like a surprising amount of cases, the friend I used to talk to every night in bed wasn't even a child, wasn't even human. I read about one case where a child's invisible friend was actually a metal poker that hung by the fireplace. So what are imaginary friends? Are they just figments of young imagination? Well, most people would say yes, and they'd argue that they can be a really hugely positive feature of child development. Indeed, there was a time when imaginary friends were seen as a warning sign of a mental health condition, but there isn't really any convincing evidence of that. People who have childhood friends turn out just as intelligent, confident, and sociable as other kids. But there are times when imaginary friends can worry parents. Some children find themselves being ordered about by their invisible pal. A study found that 1/3 of children say that their imaginary friend doesn't come when they call them and doesn't leave when they ask them to. And some even did annoying, nasty things like, for example, put yogurt in my hair. So there are times, not often, but still present, when they become problematic or worrying or even downright creepy. For example, I read a case where a boy had an imaginary friend and he called her Purple Mommy. He described her as a woman with long, dark hair and bright, glowing eyes that were nothing but white. The boy told his mother that Purple Mommy visited his room at night, picking him up, but then she would switch off the lights. And his mother's unease grew when he said that Purple Mommy always needed bandages because she was always covered in blood as she held him. And she even told the boy that she had the ability to remove her head if she wanted. Now, that was pretty freaky enough. But most worrying for the parents was what the boy told her next. He said that Purple Mommy would often lean into him in the dark and say, "I don't like your dad. I don't like him at all. I hate him." I read a case about a child who refused to go to church, and when his parents asked him why, he explained, "Well, look, my invisible friend says I'm not allowed to go to church." They were confused by this and says, "Well, what's the problem? Why doesn't he want you to go?" The kid said, "Because my friend says he can't follow me there." And so, as you can imagine, sometimes these types of imaginary friends encounters can worry certain parents. Because how do we respond when a child's so-called imaginary friends starts telling the child things they couldn't possibly know? You see, some argue that rather than talking to made-up friends, sometimes these kids may be talking to something more mysterious, even the spirits of dead relatives. We're going to look at some of those cases tonight. Others still warn that in very rare cases, these so-called friends might even be malicious, perhaps some sort of demonic entity whispering into the ear to encourage despair or even violence. Or perhaps it's just a product of a fragmented, troubled mind. Well, we'll hear from some shocking criminal cases on that too. But before we dive into this stuff, let me be clear. This is not the type of channel that is encouraging you to put an end to imaginary play or imaginary friends. Like I said, it's almost always healthy and harmless. But it's just there are some freaky cases that spill over into the potentially paranormal that I think we should explore. Michael J. Hallowell explored this topic in his book, INVIZIKIDS, The Curious Enigma of Imaginary Childhood Friends. As a young boy, he had 2 imaginary friends. The first appeared when he was a toddler. He was standing in the family kitchen, and then he saw her. He said she was a small woman with an elfin face and wavy golden hair, and she smiled at him that day, tilted her head, and said, "Hello, my name's Maureen. I want to be your friend." From that moment on, he says they were inseparable, playing hide and seek in the cupboards and bouncing on sofas, laughing together. But when his family moved, Maureen stayed behind. She didn't follow him. And in his research of imaginary friends, Michael noticed that these friends very rarely travel with their child companions. Most stay fixed to a certain location. Well, Michael missed Maureen very much, but he met a new friend after his family relocated to a flat in the northeast of England. She turned up while he was struggling to assemble a toy zoo. She was a woman called Elizabeth, she said, and when she appeared, she said to him, "Here, I'll show you how to do it." Here's a direct quote from Michael. "I watched with not the slightest degree of surprise at her unannounced appearance as she proceeded to build my zoo for me, and then she smiled and went away." Now, surely he built the zoo himself, didn't he? And imagine that she had done it for him. But no, he was sure he saw her do it. His encounters with these 2 mystery women as a child intrigued him so much through his life that years later, Michael began writing about these experiences in the Northeast newspaper called the Shields Gazette. And he also covered the topic in the esteemed paranormal magazine, The 14 Times, which I sometimes write articles for, and I also write a monthly horror film review column in. Now, when Michael put the word out to get readers to submit their stories on imaginary friends, he was inundated with letters. For example, John Alvarez from New Mexico had recalled an encounter at his grandfather's barn when he was 4. John noticed a bale of hay rustling like there was something inside it, and expecting a rat, he was ready to run away until a man's torso burst out of the hay. The figure who rose before him wore a black hat with a wide brim and introduced himself with an odd repetition of name. He said,
"Hello, I'm Raunchy. Are you okay?"
Michael Hallowell discovered that this twice-repeated name thing is a common feature in imaginary friend cases. But other cases were much more odd. For example, John Tatters lived in Birmingham, England, and he shared a startling story from the 1940s about his son. One day, while playing football in the garden, his son shouted, "Here, Stephen, catch!" and he threw the ball to his imaginary friend. John said this, "I swear down that the ball seemed to stop in midair by the bush, and then it sailed back across the garden towards my son as if thrown by an invisible pair of hands." Horrified, John dragged his son indoors and forbid him from ever mentioning Stephen again.
Hey! Where are you? Come and play! I'm waiting! Come in now!
Michael was also approached by a man called Graham Smith, who was a computer technician. Graham shared a childhood memory with Michael that always got under his skin, something that made his family question whether Graham really had an imaginary friend, or if he might have encountered a spirit of a dead child. You see, his mother used to babysit 2 brothers who lived near his childhood home. Their names were Kevin and Tony. Graham's mum would look after them when their parents were at work. Graham was at home too. He was so young, so the 3 boys would often play together. One day, the parents dropped Kevin off at the house, but this time they didn't drop Tony off. This was really quite unusual. Instead, they explained that Tony was to be taken to the hospital that day while Kevin stayed with Graham for the day. Well, Graham and Kevin played together for a while like they normally did. But then something totally unexpected happened. A 3rd boy turned up at the house. His name was Michael, and Graham wasn't sure who he was, where he had come from, but he seemed to be fun, and so Kevin and Graham played with Michael for the entire day. When Tony's parents eventually returned, they were heartbroken. Their son Tony, Kevin's brother, had passed away in the hospital that day. Graham said they looked devastated, understandably. Graham wasn't sure what had happened to Tony, but later he was told the truth. His friend had sadly developed a disease like leukemia, and Graham hadn't been aware of this until the day he died. Well, Graham asked his mother about this 3rd boy, Michael, and she said, "Who?" Graham said, "Today, when Tony was at the hospital, Michael came to play with us instead. Where was he from?" And at this, his mother broke down into tears. She didn't explain why. Later on, Graham said he overheard his mother talking quietly to his father, and he heard her saying that there was no other boy in the house that day. There was only Kevin and Graham. There was no Michael. And in tears, she told her husband that she was convinced that Tony's spirit, the boy who died, had visited the house and played with the boys like he always did, regardless of him being dead in a hospital room a few miles away. It was an intriguing and eerie idea, but Graham disagreed. He was sure that this wasn't Tony. Michael looked different. He had a different name. And besides, Graham had asked Michael specifically, "Where did you come from?" And this strange boy just said, "I come from the funny place." Graham said he never saw Michael again after that, but he was adamant that boy from the strange place, the funny place, had been present with him and Kevin on the very day when Tony died. Who was he? Was this friend there to keep them company, knowing that Tony wasn't going to return? Or was it just in his mind? Another man from Ontario, Canada, wrote to Michael Hallowell. His name was Randy James, and he said that when he was a child, he had an imaginary friend called Gron. Gron used to appear to him in the forest. James described Gron like this. He was small and had strange skin. It was shiny. He always liked to stand directly in front of me, facing me eye to eye, and if I moved my position, he would move at the same time, so that we were still facing each other. I wondered if he thought I was trying to trick him or attack him. One morning, I told him that my dad's tractor was busted and that he couldn't afford to get it fixed. When I got home, my dad said that the engine had fixed itself, but he couldn't figure out how. I knew it was Gron. For Randy James, his companion was helpful, but there are other cases where the invisible friend can be worryingly aggressive, like in this next rather shocking case. Sharon, a mother from England, said that her son, Lewis, would often talk to someone upstairs. Sharon and her husband would hear this conversation very clearly. Lewis was 8 years old, and when he carried out these heated conversations, he was by himself. Now, at first, Sharon dismissed this as just a boy talking to himself or his toys, or, yes, even an imaginary friend. It's not really a big deal. But soon, unsettling events began in the house. Tapping noises, objects disappearing, coins dropping from the ceiling, all classic elements of a poltergeist. But then, one day, things turned aggressive. Sharon and her mother were in the living room, and they were chatting together when the air suddenly exploded with a blood-curdling scream. In her report, Sharon specifically described this scream as, quote, simply horrible. She and her mother sprang up from their chairs and they bolted upstairs to check on Lewis. And when they found him, they were shocked. He was lying on the floor and he was like buried under a huge pile of clothes. They managed to dig him out and they asked the shaken kid what had happened. And he said that his invisible friend, who was called Douglas, he said, his invisible friend Douglas had thrown the clothes on him in a fit of anger. The boy was scared. So scared that Sharon did not call him silly or dismiss this mention of an imaginary friend. Instead, she lifted him up, she sat him down gently, tried to calm him down, and asked him to tell her, well, who is Douglas? Is this the boy you've been talking to? And Lewis nodded his head. And describe him to me, she said to him. Lewis said this, that Douglas was 7 years old and he wore grey shorts and a white shirt and a funny flat cap. Now, if you know anything about the British school uniform system, this is a little bit eerie. You see, Lewis was describing the typical British school uniform of a child from another era, when school kids wore such clothes. Lewis was still a toddler. He wasn't exactly knowledgeable about historical fashion trends, but yes, this little boy called Douglas, in his little grey shorts, white shirt and flat cap, had been angry enough with Lewis to bury him under clothes. Well, they carried on with their day, and it wasn't until 2 weeks later that Lewis started talking about the mysterious boy again. Only this time it was horrible. He said that Douglas had been talking to him and had told him a deeply disturbing story. Douglas told Lewis that he was dead. Not only that, Douglas said that he had been killed by his own father. Now, kids can be strangely matter-of-fact about these things, so Lewis just asked him, why did your dad kill you? And Douglas explained. He said that he used to live on a farm with his family, and he had to help out a lot on that farm, which was exhausting, he said. Well, one day, Douglas had been going about his chores on the farm, perhaps after school, when he felt tiredness overcoming him. He needed a cozy spot in the farm to take a nap. And so he went into the barn and he found a mound of hay. The plan was to go to lie on top of it, but it was actually rather chilly that day, and so he had a different idea. He would climb into the hay and gather some of it around himself. That way he could, make a little cozy nest for himself when he could sleep. I'd argue that it's also possible Douglas didn't want to be found sleeping during the day by his father, so he napped in a way that wouldn't be noticed or found out. Well, his idea worked. You see, Douglas climbed into the hay, dragged some of it over him, and eventually fell into a peaceful and rather blissful sleep. Until his father came into the barn. His father who needed to gather more hay that day. He always did that job with a pitchfork. The father went to the mound, lifted the pitchfork as usual, and he rammed it into the hay. I wasn't able to find out how many jabs it took. Perhaps it was the first, the third, maybe. But soon, at some point, the father was horrified when the pitchfork skewered something thick and heavy in that hay. In panic, he frantically yanked the pitchfork back, wincing when it finally came free, and he saw blood drizzling from the forks. He threw it to the side in disgust and then scrambled to the hay, raking it back, tossing it into the air in a frenzy, until he found his own son, either dying or dead already. This, Lewis told his mother, this was Douglas, his friend, the boy, had accidentally been killed by his father. And this was why, when Douglas got angry with Lewis 2 weeks ago, he had chosen to express that anger by burying Lewis under a pile of clothes, just as he had been buried that day. Well, the poltergeist activity in the house continued, and Sharon and her husband started to notice that it seemed connected with Lewis. For example, if Lewis was naughty, they would tell him off. And whenever they did that, the lights of the house would dim and flicker. When they asked him about it, Lewis said it was simple. When you get angry with me, it makes Douglas angry. And when Douglas gets angry, he does things to this house. The idea of an imaginary friend being the disembodied spirit of a dead person is frightening, but it appears to be an interesting possibility in some reported cases of imaginary friends, like this one from the UK. Rachel was a successful lawyer from Berkshire. She had her own legal consultancy firm, and also a 4-year-old son called Thomas. One night, she was putting Thomas to bed when he started talking about a man in his room. Worried, Rachel started looking around his bedroom, but there was nobody there. There was no sign that anybody had been there. She turned back to Thomas to say that, not to worry, there's no man in here, but then Thomas started pointing at an empty spot right next to her, and he said, "He's there. He's standing right next to you. Look." Now, this did unsettle Rachel somewhat, but not too much. She knew full well that little kids have pretend friends, and so she went along with it. She said, "Ah, yes, Thomas, you mean this man here?" Thomas was like, "Yeah, you see him too." She said, "Yes, but listen, Thomas, I'm going now to have a cup of tea. And this man is going to come and have a cup of tea with me. So you can sleep in peace because you need your sleep, don't you?" It was a clever little way of leading this imaginary friend away without belittling Thomas's belief in it. Well, she assumed that could be the end of that, but it wasn't. You see, over the coming days and weeks, Thomas said that this man kept coming back to his bedroom over and over again. And after a while, the boy started drawing pictures of this visitor. It was a bald man wearing glasses with very, very thick frames. Well, this talk about the bald man in the room went on for quite a while, and so the family just kind of went along with it. But as is the case with many imaginary friends, it started to die out, and Lewis stopped talking about the man in his room eventually, and they all assumed he'd grown out of it. A couple of years later, something happened that blew Rachel's mind. Rachel and Thomas were visiting her father's house. He was excited to see his grandson again. She'd gone there for a reason. You see, Rachel had recently decided to research her family tree, and so she was asking for information from her dad. He'd been in the loft and dragged out some old photo albums for her to look through. Thomas was there too. He was sat there idly looking through the pages, but he wasn't particularly interested. Well, by now he was 6 years old. And as they were opening and looking through these pictures, at one point Rachel turned the page and there was an old picture of her paternal grandmother, that is, her father's mother. Grandma was standing next to her second husband. Now you have to realize that actually Rachel had barely known anything about this man. She hadn't even seen a photograph of him before. But Thomas saw this man and became instantly animated. He sat up and went, "That's him! That's the man, Mummy! That's the man who used to come and play in my room." And sure enough, her grandmother's second husband was a man with a bald head and thick-rimmed glasses, just as Thomas had described. But it got even weirder. You see, straight after that, Thomas pointed at the woman standing next to the man. He pointed at Rachel's grandmother, and he said, "I know her too." Now, this made no sense because he had never seen a picture of her at this point. Rachel stared at Thomas. "How'd you know her?" He said, "Mom, that's the lady who came to our old flat and stayed with you when you had the car crash." It was true. When Thomas was only 20 months old, his mother, Rachel, was in a car accident. It was serious too. She almost lost her life. But Thomas was now saying that this woman had sat at Rachel's bedside the entire time just to be there as she slept and recovered. Rachel said that in that moment, all of the hairs on the back of her neck rose up. And she was faced with a wild question. Were the man and woman who Lewis had befriended just in his head? Or was this little boy having a profound experience of the paranormal? There's another eerie case that comes to mind. This one involved an American man who claimed that his imaginary friend, called Derek, was unique because he always said that this Derek was a carbon copy of himself. He said, quote, "We are completely identical, and I played with Derek for years, longer than what normal kids do. But he would always look at my mom and older sister with a sense of sadness, and eventually he went away." And then he said this, 23 years later, I was digging through my mom's safe to grab some paperwork that she kept for me, and I found a stillborn death certificate for a boy named Derek who shared my birthday. It was only then that I discovered that I was actually a twin, and my brother Derek had died during birth. I found another peculiar story on a forum for 14 topics. It was from a poster called Ghost in the Machine, who wrote that one of his kids had an imaginary friend. But this one was quite unique in that he'd only ever see this friend in one place and one place only: the local graveyard. Now you might ask, why was this kid in the graveyard so regularly? Well, there's a good reason for it. He said that the shortcut for him to take this child to primary school went straight through the graveyard, and so they would nip through, every weekday and take the kid this way. Now his son, who was around 5 or 6 at the time, kept talking about his friend whenever they went through the graveyard, and so the dad started asking him questions about this friend, particularly because the son would always see this friend in the children's section of the cemetery. Well, the son said his friend was a little girl. The dad was like, "Oh, okay. What's she like?" The boy said, "She's in a wheelchair." Now, he later added some information to this story, which he said might not be strictly relevant, but he struggled not to think about it in connection with the imaginary girl in the chair. Listen to this. About a year or two after his son made friends with this cemetery girl, mentions of her became less and less, until he actually wasn't talking about her much anymore. But they still had to cut through the graveyard each day for school. It was on one of these days when the dad spotted something very sad. He saw a new gravestone appear, one that he expected to see. He recognized the surname straight away because it had been reported in the local news that tragically a family of 5 had died in a house fire nearby. Now at this point, his second son was on the waiting list for a school for children with special needs. and it was getting frustrating that places were not coming up. Places at this school were like gold dust, is how he put it. Well, it turned out that one of the children who died in the house fire had a disability, and he later found out that she had been a pupil at the very school he was hoping to get his son into. Now she had died in the fire. Her place was to be offered to someone else. And that's when the dad got a contact from the school saying, a place has come up, and now your son can join the class. It turned out, the exact place that this dead young girl had left. Now, listen here, he doesn't make a big claim saying this must have been the same child. But he did discover, that this little girl had died with some sort of disability. Was she in a wheelchair? Well, he describes the situation in this way, saying, I try not to think about it. Never connected one thing with the other, and I have no idea what her disability was. Probably not a wheelchair, just a coincidence. I used to take my second son with me on the school run, and for a brief time, he was walking past the grave of the child whose school place he inherited. What do you think? Was he right to see these two things as random and unconnected? Or could it possibly be that the first son was seeing the spirit of a young girl even before she had died? A girl who would eventually help his brother just when he really needed it. In another story, a woman called Violet shared that when her daughter was 3 or 4, she had an imaginary friend called Mr. Adkins. She said he would come from one of the neighbors' houses through the wall, and all he would do was complain about how he never saw his family anymore. He was, it appeared, totally miserable. Since Violet was into spooky things, she decided to start looking into the history of the local area to see if Mr. Adkins existed. And she also asked her daughter to find out Mr. Adkins' first name. A few days later, her young daughter came back and said that she'd had asked him, but Mr. Adkins had replied to say, "It is impertinent for children to ask that question." Now, what 3 or 4-year-old would use the word impertinent themselves, I don't know. But a while later, Violet discovered that there really was a family called Adkins, who, back in the 1970s, had lived in the very house her daughter had said Mr. Adkins had visited from. Violet and her family moved from that house in 2012, and her daughter hadn't mentioned seeing Mr. Adkins since. Which again seems typical of imaginary friends. They move on, and the friend doesn't seem to follow. Well, for the most part, the imaginary friends we've talked about have been friendly, or at least neutral. Yet there are some examples of imaginary friends which can cause a lot more concern in parents and family members of the child. For example, on Reddit, a user called Rydal wrote, "My eldest daughter had an imaginary friend when she was 4 years old. His name was Jack, and he lived under our back porch. She said he liked to shove sticks down people's throats. I discouraged playtime with Jack." And then, of course, there's the famous Amityville horror case, often dismissed as a hoax. I still think it would be remiss not to mention it here. Because, in 1975, the Lutz family moved into a Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, a home that had been the site of a gruesome, very real mass murder just a year earlier, when Ronald DeFeo killed 6 members of his family. Shortly after moving in, the Lutz family reported a series of terrifying events that they believed were caused by a supernatural presence tied to the house. And among those was their young daughter Missy, who developed a connection to an imaginary friend she called Jody. She described Jody as a large pig with glowing red eyes. Jody would often visit her and was said to have the ability to vanish or change shape. Missy treated Jody as a companion, but the parents grew alarmed when George Lutz claimed to see glowing red eyes staring at him through Missy's bedroom late at night. To the Lutz family, Jody was not a harmless imaginary friend, but a sinister entity tied to the house's dark history. Now, I get it. It can be very easy to dismiss posts from forums or stories of Amityville as fake, or at least hard to verify. But there have been actual criminal cases where imaginary friends have been blamed, and this stuff happened for real. July 2013, 27-year-old Ricky Cole was brutally beaten to death in his home. The man accused of the murder was 24-year-old Jason Coate. When the case went to trial, Coate's lawyer argued that this was not a random act of violence, but one driven by Coate's imaginary friend, whom he called Vern. The victim, Ricky Cole, had reportedly overheard Coate talking to the invisible companion before his death, leaving Ricky terrified. According to the defense, Vern lived inside a black box and sometimes spoke to Coate, urging him to kill. This argument was presented in an attempt to garner sympathy from the jury, alongside claims that Coate had been under the influence of drugs at the time of the crime, and yet the jury was not convinced. Imaginary friend or not, they concluded that the killing was premeditated and fueled by rage. But it's still an interesting case for us because the defense hinged on the suggestion of an imaginary friend. One of the most unsettling cases was featured in the US TV show Dr. Phil in 2015. The story focused on Rylan, a young boy born into a family struggling with drug addiction and mental health challenges. He was eventually taken into care and adopted by Kim and Ryan. Kim and Ryan were determined to provide him with a stable and healthier home life than he was used to. But when Rylan turned 7, alarming behavior began to surface. He stomped around the house, swearing, and developed a disturbing obsession with knives. Kim and Ryan even captured video footage of him threatening to stab and kill his adopted mother and another woman. And on multiple occasions, he mimicked stabbing motions towards them as a way of intimidating them whenever they tried to take the knives away. When everyone eventually discovered the root of Rylan's obsession, it was chilling. It was an imaginary friend called Bleeder. Bleeder was a robot who, according to Rylan, began encouraging him to play with knives at just 3 years old. By the time he was 6, Rylan had inflicted horrible injuries to his own fingertips at Bleeder's urging. He claimed that Bleeder had told him that these wounds were necessary. There's another case in January 2013 of Logan Fisher, who suddenly turned on his girlfriend in a violent outburst. According to reports, he restrained her and then tried to kill her as she pleaded for him to stop. He eventually saw reason for a while and he let her go. When she got away, she called her uncle, and then he called the police, and they arranged to rescue her from a nearby parking lot, and so she ran there. But Logan decided to follow her and carry out the attack again. Thankfully, he turned up to get her and he was arrested. And during questioning, he gave an eerie explanation for his actions. He claimed he had been instructed by his imaginary friend Eric. Eric wasn't new to Logan. He was an imaginary companion from childhood who Logan thought had disappeared as he grew older. And yet Logan explained that Eric's presence had returned in his late teens, and he had begun hearing Eric's voice again. Logan insisted that it wasn't even him who attacked his girlfriend, it was Eric. He even claimed that Eric had communicated with his girlfriend that night, urging her to lash out against him. Logan rightly faced charges for his actions, and many would say, and probably are right, that this was all just a product of his imagination, his fragmented mind. And yet the thought of it, the thought of having an imaginary friend when young, and then it's suddenly turning up again, whether that's just purely natural in explanation, it's still horrifying and eerie thought. So who are the INVIZIKIDs? Are they simply the product of a child's imagination, perhaps invented to ease loneliness during childhood? Well, possibly, but Michael Hallowell actually argues that many kids with imaginary friends have siblings and they're not thought to have any sense of loneliness, so it doesn't necessarily follow that that's why they appear in the mind or otherwise. Some psychological theories suggest that children create imaginary companions so that they can have someone to control. After all, little kids don't control much in their lives, do they? They're always told what to do, where to be. It can be really refreshing to have a friend who you can say, do this, go away, come here, and they do it. But like I mentioned earlier, and in the cases we've explored, control rarely seems to play a role. In fact, sometimes it's the imaginary friends who appear to have the upper hand. Could children use imaginary friends as scapegoats, blaming them for mischief or disobedience? This is a common theory and may well be true for some, but again, it doesn't necessarily align with the accounts that we've encountered tonight. Are imaginary friends born out of a troubled mind? Well, in extreme cases like the murders we've discussed, I'd say most likely yes. But we need to remember the majority of psychologists see them as harmless and even beneficial, particularly for a child's development. And so if you know a kid who chats to someone invisible in their room, I'm not saying you have to start freaking out or tell them to stop, but it still leaves us with the question, are there certain cases where something else might be going on? Could at least some of these companions have a reality beyond a child's mind? Might they be ghosts or even entities from another realm or dimension? After collecting hundreds of accounts, Hallowell concludes that imaginary friends may not always be figments of imagination. He suggests that they could be actual entities interacting with children for reasons we don't fully understand. But in most cases, almost all, he argues that these encounters are harmless. As we come to a close, I'd say that this topic intrigues me because there's something I haven't talked about that much yet. I had an imaginary friend too. When I was about 6 or 7, I started speaking to a companion that no one else could see. Well, my friend was quite different from most of the ones we've discussed so far. She was a she, but she wasn't a human she. She was a computer. Her name was Nell. Each night I'd climb into bed and I'd tap invisible buttons on the wall and a screen would appear, though only I could see it. Shifting colours moved across that screen, which I took to be her face. But mostly we communicated through speech. I'd lie in bed, I'd tell Nell about my day, and she'd respond, asking me questions in return. What was Nell exactly? A ghost? A spirit of some kind? Well, later in life I shared this story with a Christian who suggested that Nell was a demon trying to warp my young mind. If anyone has watched the story of my own paranormal encounter back in '93, they might find this demon explanation even more compelling. But I've got a much simpler explanation. I first met Nell not on my bedroom wall, but in a Roger Corman movie, a Star Wars knockoff called Battle Beyond the Stars from 1980. And in the movie, a young man flies through space in a ship controlled by a benevolent computer with a female voice called Nell. For some reason, my young mind latched onto her and decided I needed a companion just like her to take me on adventures every night. And so Nell appeared by my bedside every night for quite a while. Sometimes I'd imagine the airlock of my ship, the bed, blowing open, sending everything hurtling into space, and I'd grab the headboard for dear life, tossing my toys and teddies as if they were being sucked into the void at the bottom of the bed. Finally, I'd reach over and hit the right button, and Nell would close the airlock, saving me from certain doom. Well, eventually I grew up and Nell disappeared. I haven't seen or heard from her since because, yes, in all likelihood, she was a figment of my imagination. But I can't help but wonder, what if, I'm being serious now, what if I went to bed tonight and I saw that familiar glow across my bed covers? And what if I suddenly heard her voice after all these years saying,
"Hello, Peter. How was your day?"
What about you? The imaginary friend you ditched long ago. How would you react if one day They simply wandered into the room and caught your gaze and said, "Hello." Would these companions be friendly like they were then? Or would they be hurt and angry, saying, "Why did you abandon me? Why did you ignore me all these years? We used to be such good friends, but now I've come back. And I'll never let you go again." Well, it's unlikely that's going to happen, but is it impossible? I'll leave that to you and your friend to decide. Because I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Who Are the Invizikids? The unsettling world of imaginary friends.